All right, folks, I'm going to teach you about something called the topics of invention, which is sort of a fancy way of saying logical thinking or ways to understand ideas in a rational way. You're probably already doing all of these things to some degree, but I think if we talk about them explicitly, that'll help you realize when you're doing them and why, and if there's any that would help you make your arguments in your essay. So, first up, and by the way, you can just literally Google topics of invention, and you can learn all kinds of in-depth stuff about them. Uh, they go really, really in depth in terms of how they work in rhetoric and how they work in language and how we make arguments. But they're about relationships between ideas. And I'm going to go through kind of the 5 more common ones that we might use. The first definition. Um, so I don't want you to, for this essay, use a dictionary definition. I don't think that that's going to be beneficial because, first of all, you're not supposed to look anything up. But second of all, we don't talk or think in dictionary definitions. A dictionary definition is maybe useful when understanding how language is kind of codified in our world, but it's not how we talk, it's not how we think. We think in terms of connotation, and we think in terms of definitions that work within the way we see the world. And two people might see the same dictionary definition, but not still think about a word in the same way or a concept. So when I say definition, I don't mean this is defined as. I mean defining a concept or a term for your reader. So don't use the word definition, but identify what this means. So let me give you an example. This is all really abstract. Let's say I'm writing about education. I'm making sort of a philosophical argument about that. Definition is about understanding who or what something is, what it's not, what groups does it belong to, what kind of thing is it, and what are the essential qualities of it. I'm not saying you go down this checklist in your essay and define them all. That's probably not useful. Instead, what you want to do here is consider when are these things relevant to help you make your argument. So when you're talking about the abstract ideas like knowledge, wisdom, democracy in your essays, you're going to need to make sure that those terms, you have clear parameters for what you're talking about. So when we get to definition around education, here's some of the things that might come to mind. Education is both an action, so it is, to educate someone is giving someone an education, as in education is to educate, to receive education. And so I might in my essay be talking about how education is sort of a two-way, for it to exist, it needs to be happening between people or between people and things. Maybe I might want to say that education is a part of basic human rights. And so I might define it as a basic right, which helps me build out other arguments about how education should be set up because it is a basic right, because it requires that back and forth. I might say that education is not, the schools, the books, the lessons, those things themselves are not the education. It is the system of how these things interact with people. So is it young people? Maybe do I need to talk about how education is continuing? So then I kind of just said education is a system. It is a complex, almost living thing that is the relationship between people, ideas, experiences that are part of our growth. I don't know, I'm sort of making this up here, but as I'm writing my essay, I might go, okay, what I really want to talk about in this essay, say the question is about sort of what is the essential nature of education, is that it can't be boiled down to one thing. It's a bunch of I'm sort of forming an idea as I go here. It's a bunch of moving pieces that work together. So now I'm defining it as something more than maybe what we've been traditionally thought. So one thing to keep in mind with definition is, are you challenging or reinforcing what most people already think? So in your essay, say you're writing about democracy, are you challenging our preconceived ideas of democracy, or perhaps you're reinforcing them, or maybe a little bit of both, but be aware of what most people think of this thing as you write about it. So education is definition is about understanding what something is, what it isn't, what it fits into, what makes it exist. It's not a cut and dry, this is the definition, because language is organic. Language is up for debate. It's not as simple as it just exists. And so that's why definition is really, really important. Next up, we'll talk about comparison. So comparison is about the relationship between different things. So how is this something same as something or someone else, and to what degree? So maybe I mentioned that it's a basic right. So maybe this piece of writing is going to talk about education in comparison to healthcare, and they're both basic rights, and both expensive, complex systems that, as set up now, benefit the wealthy. However, perhaps education is more nebulous to measure, and healthcare is easier to measure if it is successful. I'm sure there is debate about how to measure the success of healthcare, but people being sick or healthy, dying or not, is a little cleaner cut than what is a successful education. I also think the definition of healthcare is a little cleaner. Not quite, but I said a little cleaner, so that's why I said it's somewhat different. As in, medicine, doctor visits, prevention. Whereas education, people don't always agree what it is. And so I've created my sort of definition up there, and so maybe that can help me define what it is. But the fact that I had to, or I probably wouldn't have to do that with healthcare. So they're pretty different. I don't think one is better or worse, but of course we might talk about priorities, and that maybe healthcare has to come before education, because without basic health, no education can happen. And so the relationship between these things is that one has to be prioritized above the other. I mean, as we see, as we're educating from home, we are prioritizing your health versus the value of in-person education, which I guess that's up for debate, right? Because you've seen a lot of people being like, this is wrong. This is not the way to approach education. So the next sort of topic of invention, the next way of thinking about an idea, would be circumstances. So what are the circumstances around something? So when it comes to education, we might think circumstances around it is who is receiving the education. Come on, spell. We might think about what are the educational lessons. So are we talking about math skills, writing skills, or vocabulary content, or are we talking about history facts, or historiography, which is the thinking of history? We're talking about, soft skills like problem solving and communication. And so when it comes to education, people don't even agree on, like, what does that mean? What are the learning things that need to happen? When is it happening? Which ages? Time of day? Are we talking about modern education? Time period, right? Is it the same now as it always has been? How is it happening between teachers and students, between worksheet, students and life experience? Is that education? Um, class sizes, demographics of students. When you say, as a 11th grader at Egan High School, you say in education, you probably imagine yourself sitting in a classroom at Egan High School getting your education. But the fact that education, the circumstances around education are so complicated that it doesn't necessarily mean that for everyone. And this also has to do with possibilities, right? So when we talk about increasing test scores, or is that even a reasonable possibility or reasonable goal? We're talking about circumstances around education. Are we talking about, is it possible for equal access to education? What are the chances of closing the opportunity gap? What's possible? What do we hope for in the future? What do we imagine? And so a lot of times when we make up scenarios, we don't even necessarily know what's possible. So some of you writing about the democracy, you might dream of a world where the circumstances are that, democracy is a fully functioning act that is constantly in motion. But some of you might argue that that's not possible, that human nature is too fallible and that we're too selfish and greedy and that can't happen. So then we get to relationship, which is the relationship between ideas. So what comes first? What happened immediately before and after a thing? So when we talk about relationship, we're going to talk about, is it learners first, teachers first? What sets up educational success? So what's the order of how this works or how this happens? We're going to talk about cause and effect, right? Does education improve quality of life? And Google just told me that. Or does quality of life have to happen first? What would be the effects of increasing? Does improving education lead to, more kids in college? Is that good? What does that lead to? So relationship is about what happens between two things. Does one cause another? Can they coexist? Is it possible to have quality education? Maybe that's not the word I want to use. Education opportunities for all, and have public education as it looks now. Maybe the system is broken; it needs to be completely reworked. What happens, what is the effect of the current system in the future? So the goal here is to think about questions, these, relationship between ideas. Does one cause another? So let's say you're talking about the wisdom prompt and you're talking about gaining knowledge leads to sorrow. Are you saying that gaining knowledge or gaining wisdom and knowledge leads to grief and sorrow, as the prompt says? Or you could possibly, and then that leads to joy and happiness, or are you going to say that wisdom and sorrow and happiness and joy are mutually exclusive? It's either one or the other. And finally, authority. And this is probably one of the hardest, which is really about where does your argument come from? So in order to make an argument, you need to be coming from sort of position of authority. Who are you to say this? What gives you the position to say this? So how do you know what you know? So who are you to make this argument? What experience or knowledge do you have to back up your ideas? So it says, what type of authority does this argument rely? So where does your authority to say this? Well, how is the data gathered? Is this personal experience? Does your personal experience represent many? Or is it the dominant voice that leaves others out? Are there counterexamples that don't fit this authority position. So you say, I know this thing, and then someone says, well, that doesn't represent me. You don't quite have the authority to speak for me. So then it talks about witness and testimony, similar to you might think of in a court case. And witness and testimony, as in what is the point of view the information comes from. And so that might be from you, who is just one high school kid. But if you go on to this next slide here, it says more things like, what do they see to cause them to give the testimony? Why does the witness think that? So maybe you witnessed a lot of students experiencing something similar, and so that's the perspective you have, and that's where your authority is coming from. But maybe you don't witness this and you just assume that it's true, but then that's not very reliable testimony. But at the same time, maybe you reference educational experts, and you hear what teachers say, or what politicians say, which are not necessarily educational experts, and where is their authority from? So here it's a question of, where does this information come from? This is just me kind of brain dumping, but what this really boils down to is I want you to think about the information that you're writing about in relation to other information. So how do you define your complicated terms? What do they mean when you compare those terms to other terms? So some of you are already doing this, comparing grief and sorrow. You're comparing wisdom and knowledge. You're comparing democracy to authoritarianism. The fourth question is literally asking you to compare two things, freedom and safety. Circumstances, what is the situation in which these ideas exist? What is the relationship between these things? Do these things cause each other? Does one lead to the other? Can they exist at the same time? The authority, where do you come from to make these arguments? Are you an authority figure? Is this personal experience? Is it expert point of view? Where does that come from? So all of this is really about how you think about ideas. And most of you are already doing these things, but I want to encourage you to think critically about, if you're like, where do I go from here? Maybe I'm making some assumptions that my audience is thinking the same way I am, and I have to lay it out there a little more clearly.